Do you know where I am here in the city of Hartford, Connecticut? What is all this, and what used to be here? If you want to find out, keep watching this video. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. Since colonial times, the landscape of the Connecticut River as it flows past Hartford, Connecticut, has gone through a lot of changes. Many today lament that the construction of Interstate 91, which runs parallel to the river, completed a process that separated the city from its once active riverfront. In more recent years, the organization Riverfront Recapture worked to create a riverfront park system that has made the river accessible again. Their centerpiece is Mortenson Riverfront Plaza, completed in 1999 just south of Founders Bridge. Further south, below downtown Hartford, is the outflow for the Park River Conduit. The Park River, also known as the Little River or the Hog River, used to flow through downtown Hartford. At the point where it met the Connecticut River, there was a narrow peninsula known as Dutch Point because there had been a Dutch trading post in the vicinity in the 17th century. In the aftermath of the Great Floods of 1936 and 1938, the Army Corps of Engineers placed the Park River through an underground conduit. The section from Bushnell Park to the Connecticut River was completed in the 1940s, and from that time on, Dutch Point was no longer a peninsula. Underground, the engineers redirected the river to flow in a more direct line, meaning that the current outflow is now north of what had been Dutch Point. The water level of the Connecticut River was quite high when I took this photo, but it was even higher when I took this photo over 2 months later. Just downriver from the conduit is a building located right on what was once Dutch Point. This is the old intake well that was part of the Dutch Point power plant. The intake well seems to have been built in about 1920. The power plant itself existed here for 58 years, from 1904 until 1962. In 2 previous videos, I've talked about the earlier history of Dutch Point. I'll link to them in the description below. In this video, I'll give a bit of history about the power plant, which survived the great floods of the 1930s and the burying of the Park River, but did not survive the coming of the Interstate Highway. And stay tuned to the end of the video, where I'll show what the area of Old Dutch Point looks like today. Please watch to the end so you don't miss it. From colonial times until the end of the 1800s, Dutch Point had been the site of shipbuilding and lumber mills. This is a section of the 1900s Sanborn Atlas of Hartford. It shows Dutch Point just a few years before the power plant was built. The blue building in the middle, built of stone, had once been the sawmill of the Connecticut River Lumber Company. But by 1900 it was being used as a rag warehouse by the paper makers H.E.L.C.O and Company. Later that year, the building was taken over by a new firm, the Hartford Board Company, which produced binders board for bookbinders. One of the directors of the company was Thomas F. Garvin of the well-known paper business on State Street. Just over a year later, on February 20th, 1902, this paper mill was destroyed in a fire, although it seems the company soon rebuilt. The yellow buildings on the right were part of the shipyard of the Hartford and New York Transportation Company. The company transported passengers and cargo on the Connecticut River, and it built vessels at Dutch Point such as tugboats, lighters, and ferry boats. In 1904, the wooden buildings of the shipyard were taken down and the first section of the new power plant rose on the spot. The Hartford and New York Transportation Company moved its shipbuilding operations to a new yard on the East Hartford side of the river. On August 23, 1904, the Hartford Courant newspaper reported, quote, "For a week or more, the work of preparing the site for the Hartford Electric Light Company's new powerhouse at Dutch Point has been underway, and all hands have been on the watch for relics, but nothing better than old tin cans and such stuff has been brought to light. It had been hoped that the old Dutch fort might be dug up, but no sign of it has been seen," unquote. The reporter concluded, quote, "The site of the old fort cannot be definitely located anyway, for the Connecticut has been shoved eastward and Park River westward, so that the site may now be buried many feet under river deposit and may be far from the present junction of the two streams," unquote. Before building the Dutch Point facility, the Hartford Electric Light Company, H.E.L.C.O, which was chartered in 1881, utilized a plant on Pearl Street in downtown Hartford, shown here in 1902. The previous year, H.E.L.C.O had installed here a massive steam turbine manufactured by Westinghouse. Nicknamed Mary Ann, it was the first steam turbine in America installed by a public utility. Within just a few years, Mary Ann would be laboriously moved to the new plant at Dutch Point. The need for the new plant was so great that it was built very quickly. Excavation of the site began in August of 1904, and its first new turbine was activated on December 18th. As the Courant described it on December 23rd of that year, quote, "So the Dutch Point plant was projected and was carried to successful completion in the remarkably rapid time of 4 months. Completion, in its application to this subject, is a relative term. The plant is not by any means completed, and it will probably be May before the plant has the handsome parlor-like appearance of the Pearl Street plant. But the electrical fluid is being made there and delivered for use, and it's now only a question of time to thoroughly equip the building and finish it so that all the electricity generated by steam in this city will be made there, and the plant on Pearl Street will only be used as a distributing point," unquote. In another massive effort in July of 1905, Mary Ann was moved to the Dutch Point plant in sections. The most difficult to handle was the turbine's unwieldy base, which weighed at least 21 tons. No truck in the city could handle it, so a special one had to be brought in from New Haven. Mary Ann would remain in operation at Dutch Point until replaced by a new Westinghouse-Parsons turbine in 1908. The power plant originally had just one large smokestack, which is visible in the background of this photograph of boats preparing for the river parade that celebrated the opening of the Bulkeley Bridge in October of 1908. The smokestack had just been painted for the first time the previous year. On April 12, 1907, a Courant reporter described the trapeze-like activities of the painter A.S. Pettibone of Bristol, who was known as Steeplejack. Quote, "Yesterday morning he climbed up the ladder, which is on the south side of the stack, and fixed up his rigging at the top, which would support him as he swung about the tall tower in midair. Then he came down, painting as he came, on the south side. He quit when he had done that side, though there was a considerable part of the afternoon still left. The nerve-wearing that is sure to come with such a trade, and the continued muscular strain necessitates a man working a shorter day than his fellows who are at other trades. Today he will start again on the other side," unquote. The reporter noted that a small group of spectators gathered to watch Pettibone at work, and concluded, quote, "If Dutch Point were not so far from the center of the life of the city, the painting of the tower would undoubtedly call forth much more attention and comment than it has," unquote. In the following years, the power plant would go through a series of expansions that greatly increased its size and capacity. By 1920, it had sprouted many more smokestacks. This lithograph shows the area of Dutch Point viewed from the Colt Armory in 1872, back when shipbuilding and sawmilling dominated, and this view shows the same area with the fully expanded power plant circa 1918. Notice Travelers Tower under construction in the distance on the left. By 1917, Dutch Point had reached the limits of its possible expansion, but the city had ever-increasing demands for energy. That year, H.E.L.C.O acquired more land about a mile south of Dutch Point, down the Connecticut River, and in December of 1921, the new South Meadow power station opened to great fanfare. It was hailed as a model of efficiency and low operating expenses. As the Current noted on December 18, 1921, quote, "So thoughtfully and carefully has the planning and building been done that it will require only about 60 employees to operate the station at 70,000 kilowatt capacity. The Dutch Point station requires about 120 employees for 36,000 kilowatt capacity." Unquote. I mentioned before that H.E.L.C.O was a pioneer back in 1901 in using a steam turbine. Well, in 1923, the company installed another new experimental turbine at Dutch Point, one that ran on mercury vapor instead of steam. It was eventually damaged and shut down in 1927, but the following year the company completed a substantial new addition to the South Meadow plant, which contained the first commercial mercury cycle generating unit in the country. Despite the health hazards of mercury, it continued in use until it was replaced in 1948 by a new unit, and that one was finally retired in 1961. As for the South Meadow Power Complex, shown here in 1922, it still exists, and like Dutch Point, it was much expanded over the years. In the 1980s, the facility was converted to a trash-to-energy plant, which ceased operation in 2022. Turning from South Meadow back to Dutch Point, a comparison of the area in an atlas from 1909 on the left and one from 1922 on the right reveals how much the complex had grown after the final alterations to the property in about 1920. The shape of the land at the tip of Dutch Point had been changed, becoming more angular. The company also erected a bridge near the mouth of the Park River and a long coal conveyor that crossed high above the train tracks and the Park River to connect to H.E.L.C.O's property along Sheldon Street. The coal conveyor is shown here crossing above the river in a photo taken on August 31, 1925. Just over a decade later, Hartford experienced the infamous flood of 1936, which inundated Dutch Point. This photograph shows both Hartford power stations during the flood. While all the equipment at Dutch Point was submerged, the South Meadow station was built much higher, so its equipment remained mostly dry and operational, although its transformers were in water 8 feet deep. H.E.L.C.O employees worked valiantly to keep the power flowing. The lights eventually went out at South Meadow, and the Current reported the harrowing story of a plant worker who went into an elevator on an upper level. In the dark, he pressed what he thought was the button for the generator floor, but he'd actually pushed the button for the lower floor that was flooded. The elevator soon filled with water up to his neck, and he couldn't find the button to raise the elevator up. Luckily, he was rescued after shouting for help. As I said, this flood, which was followed by another big one in 1938, led to the decision to bury the Park River. This massive project was one part of a series of flood control measures that included erecting dikes along the Connecticut River and a flood wall to protect Dutch Point. Work on the initial section of the Park River conduit under downtown Hartford was completed in the early 1940s. In 1945, the State Highway Department undertook a new project, the construction of an expressway above the conduit. Heading from downtown, it went from the new Pulaski Circle to the Connecticut River, just above Dutch Point. It then continued south along the Connecticut River, past the Dutch Point power plant, passing under the plant's coal conveyor. It then proceeded to the Charter Oak Bridge, which opened in 1942. The bridge is just north of the South Meadow power plant. The original Charter Oak Bridge, shown here, was replaced by a new bridge in 1991. The new expressway was initially named the Conland Highway, after Henry F. Conlon, publisher of the Hartford Courant and chairman of the Bridge Commission, as is shown in these old postcards. But it was quickly renamed the Whitehead Highway in honor of Ulmont Irving Whitehead, Jr., who was killed at Pearl Harbor. This aerial photo shows the new highway, the Charter Oak Bridge, and both power plants, as well as the Colt Armory with its distinctive onion dome. The days of shipbuilding and milling lumber were long past at this point. This view also shows the seawall, still in existence today, that was built in the early 1940s. In the early 1960s, the section of the highway along the river became part of I-91, while the section of the old expressway connecting Pulaski Circle to the interstate still bears the name Conland-Whitehead Highway. The expansion of the highway to become an interstate spelled the end for the Dutch Point Power Station, which was demolished in 1962. So what is the area like today? Here's a photo of the plant circa 1918. As I said at the start of this video, the old intake well is all that survives of the original plant. On the right is the landward or west side of that structure today. It's still positioned midway along the seawall. If you follow the path along the river that stretches from Mortenson Riverfront Plaza on the north and Charter Oak Landing on the south, you pass right through where the power plant once stood. Between this area and the rest of the city, there are still train tracks and, of course, the highway just west of it. This photo is a view southwards, with the intake well and seawall on the left and the train tracks and highway on the right. This is a view northwards showing the full length of the seawall. And remember the coal conveyor that went over the Park River and later the highway? It would have started just beyond the fence straight ahead at the intersection of Sheldon Street with Charter Oak and Van Dyke Avenues. It's just down the street from the old H.E.L.C.O building, now Eversource, on Sheldon. If you like this video, you can learn more about Hartford's lost riverfront in this video here, so check it out.